thank you everyone for having me. So as Stuart mentioned, I'm just going to talk a little bit about where I see robots and AI at the moment, and how we got to where we are today, and then I guess postulate a little bit about what the future might look like and some things that I think gentle thinkers need to be thinking about. So just a little bit about me. I grew up in a very privileged household where we always had access to the latest technology. And, we did a lot of travel as well. So I'm the little blonde, person in that looking to climb over the fence. I'm the youngest child, so I guess that does mean that I'm fated to not necessarily take the easiest path. And I'm not sure whether, as you'll see, and with my current role, being involved in the area of earth sciences, whether this had any early influence on me or not, or why my family decides that it's great to visit, mine sites and have a look. But anyway, that's kind of the upbringing that I had. And I really vividly remember when my dad brought home a personal computer. We were the first family in the street to have a personal computer, and our neighbours lined up to come and have a look at this wondrous contraption. I never ever considered having a career in technology, and I don't know quite why that is, but meanwhile, I was always very lucky to have access to most of the latest technologies, when I was growing up. So Hugh mentioned, a little bit about my background. I like to say that I've had a non-linear career path because that sounds better than saying disorganised. And so I have kind of, wandered around and done a whole range of different things. I guess my scientific training was in the earth sciences, and I guess I moved up to Queensland actually to pursue postdoctoral research, but then I guess I found a few doors closed, and so I moved more into a broader area of research management and research commercialisation, got some experience working with UniQuest, commercialising the social sciences, and then, by a circuitous path, ended up finding myself with an opportunity to work when they were first setting up what was an ARC Centre of Excellence in a new field called Robotic Vision. Now, I was not completely ignorant about robotics because my sister's the managing director of Silicon Valley Robotics over in the US, and Silicon Valley Robotics was set up by some of the early successful robotics companies over there as a way of getting back and helping to support new up-and-coming robotics companies. And so for many years she'd been telling the rest of the family that robotics was the way of the future and we really should be paying a bit more attention, but I think I've already previewed, I'm the youngest child, she's my older sister, I wasn't particularly inclined to pay any attention. But when this opportunity came up to help set up this brand new centre, she was the first person I called, and she said, yeah, well, sounds like a great opportunity, you really need to jump on board. And so I did. And Robotic Vision at the time, the centre started in 2014, really was a new thing. What we were trying to do was bring the fields of robotics and computer vision together, and that really has become quite transformative for both robotics and AI more generally, and I'll talk a bit about that further on. But yes, it kind of seems like I've come full circle now from having a background in geology, kind of moving more into the tech space, and now with a role where I get to apply technology back into the earth sciences. So, perhaps at some point down the track I can try and make sense of the whole story. So Kieran already told me that the definition of AI might become a contentious issue, and we probably could spend the whole day arguing what the definition of AI should be, and certainly if you had a room full of robotics people, they could argue all day about what actually is a robot. My definition of AI, for the purposes of this talk, is I really think about AI as anything where we trust a machine to make decisions for us. Can broadly be termed artificial intelligence, and that can include a whole range of different things. But the important thing is that you don't have to have a human involved in making those decisions. So it relies on a fair bit of trust in the machine to be making the decisions for us, and decisions that make sense to us. And I think Australia, a lot of people are quite surprised to discover that Australia has some real strong points in the areas of artificial intelligence and robotics. And I guess my explanation for that is essentially because it's been a necessity. So in Australia, we are a gigantic continent inhabited by only a very small number of people. And what that means is that we have thousands of kilometres of infrastructure, roadways, pipelines, power lines, rail lines that need to be inspected and maintained. And we literally do not have enough people to do those tasks. And so I guess by virtue of necessity, Australia's actually had to get pretty good at developing robust forms of artificial intelligence that can go out and do many of these jobs that we cannot do as humans alone. So it's quite common nowadays that we would have aeroplanes, drones flying out and inspecting our infrastructure and helping to make decisions about when that infrastructure needs to be maintained. And so I guess the way I like to think of it is that we kind of specialise in outdoor AI, so robust forms of AI. So, to be able to operate in this vast continent where, there aren't very many people, but also we have extreme climatic conditions, it has meant that a lot of the types of AI that we develop really do have to be very reliable, be able to take extreme, temperature conditions, be able to operate often where there's communications denied. You don't have to go very far out of Brisbane before you don't actually have connectivity. And also, if you're underground or underwater, connectivity is a big issue. So in those particular areas, Australia has actually got a pretty good track record of developing AI and in particular robotics that makes us a little bit unique compared to other parts of the world. It often comes as a surprise to people that Australia was the first country in the world to automate our ports. This is some footage of the Port of Brisbane, if you haven't been out there or seen it already. If you do go out there, what you see, or when you're flying into Brisbane, as the planes land at Brisbane Airport, you can look across the river and you'll see these automated straddle carriers. This is a technology that was developed in Australia down at the University of Sydney, and then unfortunately sold on to a European company because they didn't think that Australia actually had the capability to commercialise this technology themselves. But these are in operation at the Port of Brisbane, the Port of Courtenay. No people actually go onto the port when these automated straddle carriers are operating, but there are quite a lot of people in the control centre just keeping an eye that everything is operating as it should. You probably would also be familiar with the concept that Australia was the first country in the world to start automating its mine sites with the benefit of these huge autonomous low haulage vehicles. And again, a lot of the technology that has gone into these low haulage vehicles was developed right here in Australia, unfortunately commercialised outside of Australia. But the original thinking behind this and a lot of the application has been to Australian use cases. Don't ignore the word agriculture there, sorry. What I was just going to go into in terms of robotics was, I guess I painted a picture that, we've been doing a lot of great stuff. Australia in particular has been the first in the world at doing lots of things, but I guess I've got a question for everyone, and that is, on your way to the talk today, did anyone bump into a robot? Yeah?
Oh, sorry, no. I thought you said roadblock.
No. No, it's
happening every day.
Okay, so there's the conundrum. We've got all of these advances happening in technology, and I'm going to be painting you a picture of all the incredible things that robots can do. But none of you actually interacted with a robot today, and that's actually extremely common. In fact, if you are at all worried about the robot apocalypse, Australia is a very safe place to be. We probably have only one robot to every 65 people here in Australia, and it's unlikely that unless you work in a robotics lab or you work on a mine site or at the Port of Brisbane, that you will have daily interactions with the robot. I mean, unless you count your robot vacuum cleaner at home. And so for that reason, I think that people find it interesting that there's all this talk about robots, but in their personal daily experience, most people don't interact with robots. So, why is it? Why are robots so invisible? Well, the reason is that up until very recently, robots really couldn't be trusted to work very closely alongside humans without, a lot of levels of supervision, which is why they work really well in a robotics lab or on a mine site or on the port where you can actually close it off, make sure people aren't going in there, but you're far less likely to see them as you're going about your daily life. But we've reached a tipping point in robotics where this is going to be changing. And I'll just to give you a bit of a history about, how things have started to evolve, because we have had robots and we've had artificial intelligence for more than 70 years. But really, it hasn't had much of I guess, for most of us, it doesn't really feel like it's had much of an impact. Now, I'd have to say that really up to today, a lot of robots have been very disappointing. So you probably heard about DARPA, the organisation, and how it often runs these challenges as a way to try and, lift the level of the technology that we have. Well, back in 2015, they did this DARPA Robotics Challenge, which was essentially for rescue robots. Because I guess another area where robots have unfortunately proved to be really disappointing is in the area of rescue. So in 2011, when the Fukushima nuclear reactor melted down, after it all happened, there was quite a bit of navel gazing. Japan is actually a leading country in the development of robotics, and there was quite a lot of questions about why were robots not ready to intervene during that meltdown. And so DARPA actually mapped out what would a robot have needed to have done to prevent the Fukushima meltdown, and it could have prevented a Fukushima meltdown. So, this diagram's probably a little bit difficult to look at, but basically they figured out that what needed to happen was you needed to get the robot to site. So it needed to be able to travel in a vehicle. In this case, they made it drive a vehicle to the site. Then it would need to get out of the vehicle. It would need to open and go through a door. If anybody works in robotics, that sounds really simple, but isn't. Then it needs to locate and clear a valve. It needs to cut through a wall. They then kind of put a surprise task in there. It also needed to be able to either clear or go over rubble. And then finally, it needed to be able to climb some stairs. In reality, it actually needed to climb a ladder, but that was so completely out of the capabilities of any of the robots that they had to change it to stairs. Okay, so what happened when they ran this challenge in 2015? Unfortunately, these extremely expensive robots, you can see they're all typically bipedal, so like two-legged robots, very much shaped like humans, and they failed miserably at just about every turn. So, actually getting to site, they tend to manage. Most of these were cost upwards of $2 million each. What you don't see in this video, very few robots manage to do the stairs. What you don't see in this video is every time one of these robots fall over, the team of 20 humans that go out with a stretcher to go and rescue them. You can see the robot's trying to pick up a drill unsuccessfully. This robot's trying to open a valve. Attempt to open the door. Oh yeah, this one's trying to pick up a drill. It's got a drill. And this one is just trying to exit the vehicle. So, really, unfortunately, what we discovered during that challenge was that robots were really disappointing, and that despite all of the advances that we've been making, back in 2015, 7 years ago, we really still weren't in any way, shape or form in a position where we could be sending robots in to do something extremely useful like stopping a nuclear meltdown, which would be a fantastic task for a robot. Obviously, we can't send humans in there. Now, I do have some questions about the way they went about that challenge. You'll notice that nearly all of those robots were bipedal robots. They looked quite like humans. Is that actually the best way to deploy robots in that situation? What we do know is that robots tend to be good at particular tasks. So why would we not send a team of robots in there who could have done one of those different tasks rather than expecting one robot to do everything? So I think one of the things that those challenges do, though, is make you rethink what it is you're asking robots to do. Now, often we will design robots that have similar shapes to humans because we want them to work in human environments. So it does seem to make sense that, if you need robots that can climb stairs and do all sorts of other things that humans do, it kind of makes sense that you have the same kind of arms and legs that a human does. But I think increasingly people are looking at how we can use a range of different robots to be able to do those things, or completely change the environment so that rather than suiting a human, it's actually more suitable to a range of robots. Now, when I was at CSIRO, one of my robotics research group that was part of Cyber-Physical Systems was involved in another DARPA challenge. This DARPA challenge was called the DARPA Subterranean Challenge. And essentially, again, this is a rescue robot activity. The idea is that you want to be able to send robots underground into areas where there is no communication so that they can get situational awareness to make a decision and send information back up to the surface so that someone at the surface can decide, is it safe to send humans down into that environment. So there are a number of challenges that DARPA put together to challenge robots. So this was the, assembly of robots that CSIRO, the team representing Australia, put together. It was the only team outside of the US that DARPA funded to compete in the challenge, and that was on the basis of DARPA doing a bit of a global scan and discovering that Australia really has very strong capabilities, particularly in navigation, of these sort of robotic systems in communication-denied environments, which I think, going back to those first slides, has kind of been a natural evolution of us developing the technology to help suit circumstances. So this was the team of robots that we fielded on the course. This gives a little bit of an overview. There were 3 different challenges. One was an urban underground environment. In this case, they used a decommissioned nuclear facility in Washington State. The first one was the last one was an underground natural environment, and the first one was an underground mine environment, man-made environment. Now, this was particularly challenging because the walls of this nuclear facility were several metres thick, so that in itself is a barrier to communication. But add to that the fact that you're underground, most of the teams had to find ways to actually drop communication nodes so that they could maintain connectivity up to the surface. So this just gives you a bit of an idea of the different range of environments. But basically the teams had to do a couple of things. They had to be able to identify certain artefacts, and that's how the teams got points and how they decided which team won the challenge at in the final point. Yeah, so that's just showing the kind of timeline of the events. So they had to be able to identify a human, they had to be able to identify a gas leak, they had to be able to identify a mobile phone, and they had to be able to identify a red backpack. But also they would add some complexity, such as smoke machines, so that you couldn't necessarily rely on one sensor. So you couldn't rely on vision. With the gas leak, obviously vision wasn't going to be very useful, so you had to have a range of sensors on board. So this is the team from DARS 61. We worked in with a couple of local companies, BIA5 and Emerson. This is the BIA5 Titan platform, which is taking the Emerson drone into the underground course. And then what you'll see soon is the drone launching off the back of this vehicle. And then the Emerson drone was the only one in the field of competitors that was successfully able to navigate its way down one of these underground shafts. So you'll see that coming up in a minute. These are all, they might look simple, but they're all actually very complex tasks. None of this is remote control. This is all done autonomously. So it's just figuring out its environment at the moment, and then you can see it's lowering its way down the shaft. So it was a combined team of researchers plus 2 local companies that were developing different robotic platforms, one underground, the other one on the surface. And what they were able to do was actually send real-time information back up to the surface and really paint a very detailed picture in real time of what the robots were seeing. This is a bit sped up. You can see they've used a thing called Paint Cloud to really give a very good visual representation of what the robots are able to see while they're down there. The humans were able to help identify objects. In fact, that was actually a requirement. When the robots thought they had come up with something, they would communicate that up to the operator, and it was up to the operator on the surface to actually let DARPA know when they thought they'd identified one. You did get penalised. You couldn't just keep saying, yeah, there's something there. You got penalised for the amount of guesses that you had, so it paid to guess accurately. Now, the Australian team very narrowly came second by about, I think it was less than a minute, because the team that won had managed to identify the same number of objects but in just a slightly smaller amount of time. There was only 1 hour to send the robots in to these underground environments to map as large an area as possible, so the artefacts were spread over quite a large distance. So anyway, I mean, things are improving, and there's a reason for that. I mean, probably the reason that we're hearing a lot about AI and robotics at the moment is just because of the huge volumes of money that are being invested in the area. Sadly, not so much in Australia, but certainly in most other developed nations, people are pouring money into artificial intelligence. So why are people pouring money into this area? Why is there such a high level of interest now? Because, I guess I've previewed, we've actually had these technologies for 70 years. What's different now? Why are we investing? And it's because, a lot of people do believe we're starting to get a tipping point, and most of that is related to the huge improvements in computer processing power that we have. So, 75 years ago, the world's first computer, the ENIAC computer, weighed 30 tons, and we now all have more power, contained in our smartphones, in our pockets or in our bags, than the ENIAC computer was able to introduce. And not only do we have far more computer processing power, we can generate that power, in devices that are much cheaper and lighter, smaller than they've ever been before. And so what that means is that we can start to build things like robots to take advantage of the current situation. And why that's important is, and this goes back to the whole reason that the Centre for Robotic Vision formed, was because it now enables us to really leverage cameras for use on mobile devices such as robots outdoors or indoors, and be able to use that information to get those robots to do things in real time. So what happened when robots were first invented was that if you wanted a robot to go from here to the door, say, if you were to try and use a camera to get the robot to do that, the robot would take so much time getting an image of the scene and then trying to process all of that rich visual data that it could have taken a few hours or a couple of days. And in that time, of course, the scene might have changed. So you couldn't rely that it was still safe for your robot to go from here to the door. There might be 20 people in the way now. And so at about the same time, LiDAR was invented. So roboticists pretty much moved wholesale over to using laser range finding as a way to get a 3D map and sense of the world. So they were able to generate 3D point clouds in real time, so that a robot with a LiDAR would be able to sense if there was anything in the way between it and the door and safely be able to make that trip. And so for quite a long time, but having said that, so roboticists moved over to LiDAR and they rejected cameras for the most part. But that didn't mean the people who were focusing on computer vision just stopped what they were doing and waited for the roboticists to kind of move back to cameras. They kept developing algorithms to interpret the imagery that they were getting in photos and videos. And of course, computer vision now really powers companies like Google and Facebook. And so back in 2014, it was kind of time to bring these two things back together. They'd started to evolve quite separately, but robotics was really getting to the point where it needed to leverage all of the new work that was happening in computer vision, because robots were finally ready to be able to use cameras as one of their main sensing mechanisms. And certainly in self-driving cars like the Tesla, vision is one of the main sensing systems that it relies on. But really, it wouldn't have been much point in them trying to do that several years ago, because You wouldn't have been able to do things in real time, but you can now. So what it means is that you can put cameras on even very small robots that enable them to do things and go to places where you might not want to send a person, such as in this case, the robot is taking the camera to take a photo of a lion, or you don't want to put a human that close to a lion. There's a whole range of things that we can now do with robots thanks to this incorporation and, I guess, merging back in of robotics and computer vision. So when I was with the Australian Centre for Robotic Vision, we put together the first robotics roadmap for Australia back in 2018. We've recently released another version of that. And the reason that we did that was because what I recognised was that although a lot of our researchers were coming up with some really interesting ideas, we were developing some interesting technologies, we've had some great talent, we seemed very disconnected with the local robotics industry. In fact, it was lucky if the researchers could name more than one or two local companies. And I thought, surely we have more robotics companies than that. So this was really a first attempt to try and actually map out what the capability in robotics was in Australia. And what we found were that there were, arguably more than 1,000 companies that have robotics capability. That doesn't mean they're robotics companies that specialise in robotics, but they might have a department or at least a group that is working in the robotics space, and that, is conservatively probably worth more than $12 billion to the Australian economy, and plus employing, just trying to remember the figure, was it more than 18,000 people. But it's very hard to really get those figures because the Australian Bureau of Statistics doesn't collect the information that we necessarily need, and not all companies conveniently label themselves as robotics companies. So it's a bit like trying to also map out the artificial intelligence ecosystem here in Australia. There are some challenges. We know a lot of good stuff's happening. But I guess where I'm going with this is that since the 2018 to 2022 roadmaps were produced, we've now come up with a huge number of robotics companies that didn't exist back in 2018 that now exist here. Things are really going off, and I'd have to say that while COVID, has obviously been an unfortunate experience for just about everyone, there's never been a better time to be a robotics or AI company in the world, really. COVID has really sped up a lot of the acceptance around the use of these technologies because there are many use cases where, for example, when COVID first hit, where people needed to get supplies, but people were reluctant to be working in warehouses or in our meat processing facilities, places like that. So there's now a very clear case for the use of robots so that we don't have to have people being put in dangerous situations. When you go and ask AI and robotics companies where are the different sectors of the economy where they see the most opportunities, this is their response. So you can see defence, mining and energy, agriculture, all the areas where outdoor AI, as I like to call it, tend to feature are the areas that are most commonly cited, then manufacturing, healthcare, transport. One thing that I find interesting about this, though, is that this is actually a survey of the companies, Australian companies that are supplying robotics and AI. One sector that is conspicuously missing from this is financial services. Now, I would actually say that in terms particularly of AI, the sector that is the most mature in terms of their adoption of artificial intelligence is the financial services sector, but they do it all in-house. And so when you survey robotics and AI companies here, they don't tend to put financial services because those outside companies don't exist. The banks and financial institutions keep that all in-house, which is kind of interesting. So I just put that up there. I think there are a range of opportunities here, and at the end of the day, there's not going to be any sector that is going to be unaffected by these new technologies. So just to take you, for a bit of to give you some examples from different sectors. I mentioned that we've had robots for more than 70 years and the area where they first started were in car manufacturing plants. This is actually the Tesla car manufacturing plant in Fremont, California. That you can see people here, but when you look at the big cells with the large robots in them, you'll notice that they're caged off from humans. You don't have people operating in those cells. And, this is traditionally how robots have operated. We've had to keep them separate from people. We can't trust them to work alongside people without injuring them. And this is another reason why people will commonly not encounter a robot in their daily lives, because the old-fashioned, robots really did have to be kept separate from humans for safety reasons. But a lot of that's changing. I guess the other thing about those big robot industrial arms is, they probably cost a minimum of $2 million each. So they're out of the range of affordability for a lot of our manufacturing companies, which tend to produce niche products and, don't have the high production capacity of the motor vehicle industry or the electrical components manufacturing industry. But what we're now seeing is that with improvements in 3D printing, a point where we're starting to democratise the availability of robotics technology. So this is a 3D printed robotic arm called Dexter. It was developed by a company that started off in Toowoomba, and really gives you the ability to buy your own build your own robotic arm, which has very high precision. Obviously, it's not going to pick up a car like those ones that you saw at Tesla, but can still do a lot of really useful things and cost less than $10,000. So you print a lot of these components yourself, you buy some of the motors and controllers, but in general, we're now starting to get to the point where even small manufacturers could be starting to harness the power of these technologies in their operations. And one area where operations have really been revolutionised is in the area of logistics. So unfortunately, we don't have a lot of logistics robotics companies here in Australia, just as we actually don't have a lot of industrial robot arm manufacturing companies here in Australia. We tend to just have the sales arms of these companies here. But this has really changed the way a lot of people think about robotics. So if you haven't seen this before, this is an example of an Amazon warehouse. Just trying to remember what year it was. It might have been 2017. Amazon spent a couple $100 million purchasing a company called Kiva Robotic Systems. So this is the system that Kiva had developed. And what you would notice is that the robot actually goes in under the shelf and lifts the shelf up so it can transport it around. Now what it means is you can completely redesign your warehouse, because you design it with the idea that no people ever go into the warehouse. In fact, the only area that people are used is for the picking task of order fulfillment. So the robots know where, and the other thing that this means, for a start, it means that you can have the rows very close together, because you don't have to worry about having space for people to go up and down. The robots are just going in under. It also means, you might notice, those shelves are completely randomly stacked. So if this was a warehouse that was built for humans to go around and pick up the goods, you'd have the toilet paper all here, you'd have the clothing all here, you'd have the books all here, because that makes sense to us. But for a robot, it doesn't matter. All the robots know is that there's stuff, and it's on, one of these shelves, and they just have to maximise how quickly they can go on the shelf. So essentially what happens is that you'll have a human who will pick items and put them in a box that gets sent. But if you order something from Amazon, these robots will get your order list. They will go off into the warehouse, and one robot will pick up an item, the other robots will go and collect the other items. Then those shelves will go past a human who's stationary, who doesn't move, and the human just has to go, okay, what's the first item on the list? Okay, that's on this robot. I'll pick that off the shelf, I put it in the box. Then the next robot will come past with the next item. The human picks it off the shelf, puts it in the box, until all the robots with all of the items that you've ordered have gone past, and the humans put everything in the box. Of course, the next thing that Amazon and most warehouses are looking at is how you can actually have a robot doing the picking task. This is an area where humans are going to have an advantage for, I would say, at least the next 20 years, because we have nothing in robotics that is anything like the dexterity of our amazing human hands. So they really are amazing pieces of equipment that it's very hard for a robot to replicate the abilities of our hands. So in agriculture, this is a company that started up in Emerald by one of the local farmers that will autonomously identify and spray weeds. So that is a robotics company that's raised a fair bit of money here in Australia at the moment. We also are seeing robots applied to public safety. This robot was the one that I showed was used by the CSIRO Data 61 team, which was developed by a local company, BIA5, which was started by 2 police officers. These 2 police officers were part of the Tactical Response Unit, and it's a lovely Australian story. They wanted to get a robot to help them in their tasks, so they looked up a couple of robot catalogues, couldn't find anything they liked, so they started their own robotics company. And this is the result. This was originally developed for tactical response and things like sieges, but they've now been able to develop it so that it can also potentially be used for firefighting. It's just a very robust, reliable platform. Here in Queensland too, we are part of the Boeing's air power teaming systems, developing what they call the Loyal Wingman, an autonomous aircraft that will act in conjunction with crewed aircraft to help our Air Force. Increasingly, we are seeing drones being used, including autonomous drones operating autonomously to inspect a lot of our critical infrastructure and to make sure that we don't have to send people up into high places. So there's a number of different companies that are using that at the moment. There's a local company here called Modus that has developed what they call Fitbit for machines. So that little orange round tag on the side of the machine is essentially measuring vibrations and then uses artificial intelligence to inform the factory or packing line when there's likely to be a failure of equipment so that they can conduct preventative maintenance and stop unnecessary shutdowns. We're seeing a huge variety of applications in medical. So this is just one. Another local company called Maxwell has developed some systems, including one for identifying prostate cancer from these images. If you actually are unfortunate enough to get prostate cancer, then the good news is that the Wesley Hospital just down the road is actually Australia's busiest robotics hospital. Unfortunately, these are not Australian robots, but this is the Da Vinci robot system. It's used in particular, it's used for prostate cancer surgery because of the precise nature of the ability of the robot to be able to conduct the surgery. So essentially you still have a surgeon doing the surgery, but what the robot does is it actually implements controls. You could think of it as increasing the lifespan of the surgeon, because surgeons tend to be limited by their hands. So as soon as you get older and your dexterity decreases, particularly if you develop any shakiness, that's a problem for you if you're a surgeon. Whereas this actually can enable surgeons to have longer careers because the robot will have limits that stop the surgeon from, accidentally, shaking at the wrong time while they're conducting surgery. And if you visit the University of the Sunshine Coast, there are probably a lot of areas where robots are operating, but you don't ever see them. So there's a lot of, there are actually kilometres of underground tunnels up at the University of the Sunshine Coast where their robots operate. So they move equipment, they deliver all the food, they move all the bed linen around the hospital. They have their own lifts, and they, at the right time, will go and pick up the food and deliver it to where it needs to go, all without people being in the system there at all. But again, this is all kind of back of house work, so most people are unaware that it's going on. I guess the question is, when are we going to see more front of house robots operating? So we are starting to see some interesting trials around Brisbane. The Dominos Robotics unit, Drew, on the right, seemed to be a little bit more of a marketing ploy, but it is true that most pizza deliveries do occur within a kilometre of a pizza outlet. And so you would think some ground transportation of pizzas probably makes sense, but we still have that problem where no one knows whether robots can legally cross the road. But you can see the Drew unit, could keep cold drinks cold, keep the pizza hot for you, and then have some safety mechanisms. We're certainly seeing food delivery robots in other countries starting to gain traction, and we've got delivery trials of Google Wing. down in Logan delivering things like coffee at the moment to households. So a lot of this stuff might seem a bit like science fiction, but it's actually happening in our own backyards. We're seeing AI applied in all sorts of different occupations. So there's a local company that is developing AI in real estate and can essentially take away a lot of the phone conversations that people have. Because if you don't think of it like a chatbot, it's much more intelligent than your average chatbot. It just takes a lot of the workload that real estate agents would normally have to go through and has it dealt with by the AI. And I guess further evidence that Australia is actually not bad at AI came, was it last year or the year before, there was a world first Eurovision AI song contest and Australia won. And this is the winning team. This is Uncanny Valley, who won the Eurovision AI song contest with their song Beautiful World, which you can download on Spotify and listen to. And so I guess good example of something that Australia has won in that space. I think that in terms of what this means for certainly people who run businesses, is that you do have to consider how artificial intelligence is going to impact on all businesses. It doesn't matter what sector you're in. There's a lot still to be done in terms of helping businesses understand what data that they have and how that potentially could be used to generate funds for the business. Unfortunately, what we do often see is that the companies who develop the AI tend to take a proprietary interest in the data and insist that the company's data is actually theirs. There's a particular problem in agriculture at the moment that farmers are starting to push back on. Workforce planning is going to be increasingly important in the future as we start to think about different technologies that can be applied. A good example of a company that did really think this through is Rio Tinto. So when they started thinking about applying those load haulage vehicles, they realised that they would probably cease to have the role of truck driver. Now, truck driver had been an entry-level position in the mining industry, so they thought, well, what is going to be the next entry-level position? And they decided that that might be a field technician, so someone who can actually service these autonomous load haulage vehicles. And they worked with the local TAFE to develop courses so that people could gain the training necessary to get the new entry-level positions into the business. But I think this should be like a part of corporate social responsibility, that as we are starting to take these technologies up, we also think about what needs to happen to help the existing workforce to adapt to the new technologies. And unfortunately, it's still true, there's very little support for SMEs. This is particularly an issue for Queensland because 90% of Queenslanders are employed by businesses with 20 people or less. And so it really is going to be a challenge to see how a lot of our local businesses can adapt to and adopt new technologies. Now, I just was going to take you on a bit of I'm sorry, I'll go quickly through this because I know we're kind of probably a bit over time now. I was just going to quickly take you on a bit of a journey of where I think things are heading. So I mentioned that, Robotic Vision started to become more of a thing around 2014 when the Australian Centre for Robotic Vision started. At the same time, and I guess a bit unexpectedly for the researchers that were involved, deep learning really started to have quite a strong impact in this area, to the point where, instead of having to code robots and tell them, with line-by-line instructions about what they need to do and when they need to do it, it became, much easier for you to train robots to know what they needed to do. Very much the same way in which most of our teenagers currently learn how to do things, and that's just by watching YouTube videos. So there's a lot of work happening at the moment, for example, trying to get robots to cook, where people literally plonk the robot in front of YouTube videos of people cooking and then see what the robot ends up coming up with. I guess that's where the power of deep learning comes in. It kind of enables you to really just show what it is that you need the robot to do, and then a lot of the gaps are filled in by the artificial intelligence. And why that's important is that, I think the real power of robotics and AI that I think sometimes people don't appreciate is that unlike humans, once one robot knows something, then all robots know it. So if we want to learn something new, we have to, go to the computer, go to Google, pick up a book. You can't train your kids by just downloading all of your information onto them, although sometimes that would be quite tempting. We don't have that same ability. Whereas once one robot knows something, then really, in essence, all robots can know that thing. You don't have to train them all up individually. And what that means is that we can then achieve scale. So if we can get a robot to solve a particular problem, and if it's a big enough problem, then we can start to look at how we can apply a lot of robots to solve that. So an example that you might consider would be this Robotic Vision powered underwater robot developed at just locally here at QT called RangeBot. So it has the ability to both survey the Great Barrier Reef and check on its health, but it also can do things such as deliver injections to help control the number of crown-thorn starfish, which unfortunately are eating the Great Barrier Reef. It can also be used to do things such as collect coral spawn, because as our ocean temperatures rise, coral is now spawning in temperatures that are too high for coral development. So, if we could, what would make a lot of sense is if we could actually just collect that spawn and move it down into areas where the ocean temperature is conducive to the development of coral. But how do we do that? The Great Barrier Reef is the size of Italy. We actually don't have enough people to even control the numbers of crown-thorn starfish. The only areas where we control crown-thorn starfish are tourist areas, and only a small amount of those at that. So if we can develop robots that can do these tasks, and if we can then scale that up, we actually could have a show at making a dent in some of these problems, and then look at some of the larger issues around climate change that could be being addressed through this technology. I think the other thing to consider is that robots don't always look like robots. So this was some work that was being done at CSIRO when I was there, where we just had a SID chrome trolley there, and we turned it into a robot by putting robot wheels on it. And so I think increasingly what we'll see in the future is you won't see platforms that are developed right from the ground up to become robots. We'll actually just see some of our everyday items turn into robots by applying some technology to them. The other thing that is starting to happen is that we're using AI to even develop our robots. So, or as this headline in Wired magazines suggests, helping robots evolve weirdness in shoes. I see a lot of potential in this. So essentially, the team that I was working with at CSIRO was looking at how you could apply AI first to select the material that you build the robot out of to maximise what the purpose of the robot was, then to actually use AI to work out the morphology of the robot component that you were building, and then to use AI to train that robot to do whatever it was intended to do. So in this case, this is actually a robot leg that the AI, and on the right too, that's a different form of the leg that an AI developed. We were able to 3D print these prototypes and then put them onto a robot. And the idea was that we were looking to develop a robot that could walk through water effectively. And these were two of the designs that the AI came up with. We then tested them out, and we essentially asked the robot to teach itself how to walk through water. And so really the whole thing was done using evolutionary AI algorithms. And what, to my mind, that means is that we're opening up this huge new range of possibilities of things that, sometimes we're limited by our own imaginations. What AI is doing is actually opening up this whole new world of a picture of different things and different ways that we could develop things, different ways that things could look that we might never have thought of ourselves. And while there are some advantages to us building robots that look completely unusual, there are also a lot of advantages to us building robots that look like us. So some of you may have seen this robot. This is a platform called Pepper that was developed by SoftBank Robotics. And you can see Pepper has beautiful hands. Pepper was specifically designed the way that it is. Obviously, we don't have one here in real life, but it stands about this high. That's so that it is small, so it's non-threatening to us. It has those big eyes, because those are childlike, which make us feel some empathy towards the robot and also make us more patient with the robot when it is slow or does things that are stupid, which I can guarantee with Pepper will happen quite often. And as I mentioned, it's got these beautiful hands, but the hands are completely useless. You would not ask Pepper to go and fetch you a cup of tea. That would not end well. But the reason that Pepper has these beautiful hands is because the sole purpose of these hands is to actually be used to communicate with us. So Pepper is what we call a social robot. It is designed purely to interact with us. Now that leads us to an interesting question, and that is how we emotionally respond to robots. Because the way that Pepper was designed was actually very specifically done so that you will respond at an emotional level to the robot. Now, what that means is that we get to the point of what people call robotic nudging. Because we know that with embodied technology, so that's technology that we make in a shape that looks something like a human, has something like a body, we respond to it differently than we do to technology such as a phone or such as your laptop computer. We would pay more attention to advice that you get from embodied technology like one of these humanoid robots than you would to advice from your phone or your PC, but also from advice from another human. So we actually, while I was at QT, there was a study done that showed that people were more likely to take advice from a robot clinician than a human clinician. Now there's a whole bunch of reasons behind that. I mean, partly because robots are fundamentally non-judgmental, so sometimes you might feel more comfortable sharing information with a robot than you would with a human. But we also, in some respects, are fooling ourselves. Most people think that robots are objective, like Data in Star Trek, that it'll be painfully truthful with you at all times. But that's not true. Robots are only as objective as they're programmed to be. However, I think this is going to be a challenge for us as robots become more common, and that's how much we trust robots, because robotic nudging can be good. You can use robotic nudging to encourage people to make healthier lifestyle choices, for example, but more commonly it's probably just going to be used to sell us stuff. And we know that people respond emotionally to their robots. This is quite a famous robot called Scooby Doo that served in the US Army in Iraq. So during its career, it was able to disarm 17 improvised explosive devices, 1 car bomb, and it retrieved 1 unexploded bomb. But then, unfortunately, Scooby's time was up, and Scooby was destroyed in carrying out its programmed activity. Now, Scooby's team was pretty upset about this, so one of Scooby's human team actually picked the robot up, took it back to the repair shop at base, and asked that they fix the robot. And the repair shop looked at it and went, sorry, we're not going to be able to fix this robot, but don't worry, your unit's going to be allocated a new robot. At which point the soldier became visibly upset and said, I don't want another robot, we want Scooby Doo. So it is not uncommon for these ordnance disposal units to name their robots, to actually promote them, to record their successful missions, to award them medals, and even to have funerals for destroyed devices when they are damaged in the course of their actions. Which then raises an interesting question of whether we're going to get to a time when we hesitate to send our robotic helpers out into the firing line. And just as we care for as humans care for robots, I mean, increasingly robots are caring for us. So we're starting to see in-home robots. This is a little in-home robot called Buddy. Buddy is reading the very fine prescription print for its owner. And there's a whole range of other tasks that Buddy can be assigned to, just simply patrolling the house, making sure its owner hasn't had a fall, putting its owner in touch with family members through video conferencing. Does anyone here have a Google Home or an Alexa? Yeah, a few people. So I wonder whether we're actually, instead of going straight to companion robots, what we might see is an evolution of some of these devices that we already have in our homes, like our Google Home and Alexa, where at some point you might decide that it's useful for those devices to have a camera, so that it can, I guess, check out what you need to put on the shopping list, do some other useful things, and then you might decide that it's useful for it to have wheels. Because, yeah, then you can give one to grandma and it can be keeping her company in her house. It's not as intrusive of having a whole range of sensors all through the house, but it can be keeping an eye on whether there's been an accident and then alert someone. And perhaps we won't even notice as these technologies start to enter our home, except to appreciate a technology that actually allows us to stay in our own homes for longer. And then that brings me to cybernetics. So as we have an ageing population and people will want to have healthy old ages, increasingly we're going to see more and more implants being used. So unfortunately we don't have anything as sophisticated as Luke Skywalker's new hand, but we are developing more and more implants, and as we do, those implants are going to be smart implants. So they will have sensors that, in many cases, will be making decisions about what they should do. Just if you think of a pacemaker, many people worry about humans always being in control and making decisions, but you don't want your pacemaker to be hanging around going, oh, excuse me, I've detected that your heart rate's irregular, would you like me to do something about that? No, we actually expect our pacemakers to make that decision for us and to take action. And that's exactly what we're going to be seeing with a lot of our implants. And so then, where are we drawing the line between what is human and what is machine when these implants become an integral part of us? This was an interesting experiment done at QT at the performance of Dante's Inferno using exoskeletons. Now, the purpose of exoskeletons is actually to help people, might help you to lift things, do more. But in this performance, the exoskeleton actually has control. So these people are not bad dancers. They are actually dancing with movements that are being controlled by the exoskeleton. I was part of this experiment, and I have to say I hated every second of it. Some people really got into it. But I thought this was a really useful experiment that it wouldn't be bad for most technologists to take part of, because it makes you appreciate being at the mercy of the machines that we create, and whether that's a good thing, and how we can make sure that we always do retain that sovereign control over our own bodies. And of course, everyone has heard a lot of the disturbing headlines about robot apocalypses, and there are a lot of movies that suggest that AI is going to take over the world. But I'm less concerned about that, and I guess more concerned about the fact that we don't seem to be asking a lot of questions about what are the grand challenges that we can solve with these powerful technologies. What are the things that, if we had the tools at our disposal, which I believe we will have through our own robotics, what are those important things that we're going to direct that technology to try and tackle? Because there are so many problems where we can't tackle them just as humans alone, but technology could make an enormous difference. And finally, there's a lot of debate over, how much we should be using AI and robotics in particularly things like aged care. But on the other hand, we know that in many aged care facilities, some residents never receive any visitors. So I think that, if anything, the development of these technologies is going to start making us question what it means to be human. And maybe it will even help us to rediscover our humanity as we start to think about what does it actually mean to be human in the age of robotics and AI. That's where I'm going to leave it. Thanks.
Thank you.